The whole church hall went silent the moment the little boy called the hired cook Mama, because everyone in Sweetwater knew Thomas Alder had buried that word with his wife. Nell Harper stood beside the serving table with flour on her apron, and both hands wrapped around an empty biscuit tray, wishing the floorboards would open beneath her plain brown shoes. A minute earlier, Mrs. Beatrice Vale had smiled sweetly in front of half the town and said, "Don't confuse a cook's apron with a wedding veil, Miss Harper." A few women near the punch bowl had covered their mouths. A few men had looked down at their plates. No one had defended Nell. Not the pastor. Not the ranch hands. Not even Thomas Alder, who stood near the front door in his black Sunday coat with one hand resting on his son's shoulder, and a face carved colder than Wyoming stone. Nell had told herself not to expect kindness. Expecting kindness was how a woman got hurt in quieter ways. So she only lowered her eyes, pressed her thumb against the worn seam of her apron, and reminded herself what Thomas had said the first evening she arrived at Alder Creek Ranch. "You're only here to cook. Nothing more. Not family. Not comfort. Not a woman worth choosing. Just hands for bread. Hands for stew. Hands to keep a house alive while the people inside it pretended they were not starving for something deeper than supper." Beatrice took one step closer, her silk gloves bright against her dark green dress. "A rancher has to think of appearances," she said, turning her smile toward the room. "A lonely child will cling to any warm hand, but that does not make the hand respectable." Nell felt the words land exactly where Beatrice meant them to land, against her size, against her station, against every inch of her body that had been judged before her heart ever had a chance to speak. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears made cruel people lean closer. She only gathered the empty plates one by one, the way a woman might gather what little dignity she had left. Then a small chair scraped across the floor. 5-year-old Luke Alder slipped out from beside his father. He was a slight boy with serious gray eyes, his Sunday collar crooked, one biscuit clutched in his small fist. The room watched him cross the hall. Thomas reached for him but stopped when Luke looked back, not frightened, not confused, only determined in the solemn way children become determined when grown folks have made a mess of the truth. Luke walked straight to Nell and pressed himself against the side of her skirt as if that was where he had always belonged. Nell froze. She did not touch him. She did not dare. Then Luke lifted his face and spoke clear enough for the back pews to hear. "Mama, can we go home now?" The biscuit tray slipped from Nell's hands and struck the table with a soft wooden knock. Beatrice's smile vanished. Every whisper in the church hall died. Thomas Alder stood by the door without moving, but something changed in his face, something sharp breaking loose after being locked away for years. Nell looked down at the boy. Her breath caught somewhere behind her ribs. "Luke," she whispered, careful as a prayer. "Sweetheart, you don't have to call me that." Luke held tighter to her skirt. "But you came back," he said. "Mama's come back." Across the room, Thomas closed his eyes for half a second, and when he opened them, he was no longer looking at Nell like a cook who had overstepped her place. He was looking at her like a man who had just realized his empty house had been speaking through his child all along. But 10 days before that church supper silenced Sweetwater, Nell Harper had been standing alone at the rail station with one carpetbag, $3, and a recipe book tied with string, while the family that promised her work rode away without her. The train had been gone for nearly 20 minutes, but Nell Harper still stood beside the freight platform as if staring hard enough down the tracks might bring it back. Cinders drifted in the dry wind. Her carpetbag sat at her feet with the handle split down one side, and the recipe book her mother had left her was tied shut with a faded blue ribbon because the spine had given up 2 towns ago. The Wilkes family had promised her $6 a month, a cot near the kitchen stove, and steady work cooking for their 3 children on a claim north of Sweetwater. They had smiled when they hired her in Omaha. Mrs. Wilkes had even said a woman with soft hands must know how to make a tender biscuit. But when the conductor called the last stop and Nell stepped down into the Wyoming dust, Mr. Wilkes looked her over in the flat afternoon light, from her round cheeks to the way her brown traveling dress pulled tight at the waist, and his smile changed. He spoke quietly but not quietly enough. "We cannot have people laughing before we even reach our place." Mrs. Wilkes would not meet Nell's eyes. Their wagon rolled away with Nell's trunk still strapped behind it, and by the time she found her voice, There was nothing left of them but wool tracks and shame. The station master came out with a broom and swept around her shoes. "You waiting for somebody, ma'am?" "Work," Nell said. "I was promised work." He leaned on the broom and looked toward the empty road. "Promises are light things out here. Wind carries them off." Nell bent to lift her carpet bag. The handle tore loose. A tin measuring spoon, 2 handkerchiefs, and a small paper packet of yeast spilled into the dust. She knelt quickly, her face burning, gathering each thing before the station master could sigh again. That was when a shadow fell across the platform. "That yeast still good?" a man asked. Nell looked up. Thomas Alder stood at the edge of the boards, tall and straight in a dark coat that had seen weather but no neglect. His hat shaded his eyes, though not enough to hide how tired they were. Beside him waited a buckboard with one restless bay horse and a little boy sitting stiff as a fence post on the seat, both hands wrapped around a carved wooden horse. The child did not blink much. "Yes, sir," Nell said. "If kept dry." Thomas nodded toward the recipe book in her hand. "You cook?" "I do." "For children?" Her answer came softer. "Yes, sir. Especially for children." Something in his jaw tightened, not quite pain, not quite hope. "The cook I hired out of Cheyenne did not come. My ranch is 12 miles east. Supper is usually poor, breakfast is worse, and my boy has taken against nearly everything put in front of him." The station master gave a short laugh. "You mean to hire her, Mr. Alder?" Thomas did not look at him. "I mean to ask what she charges." Nell rose slowly, dust on her skirt, dignity held together with both hands. "Room board and $4 a month until I prove worth more." "3," Thomas said. "And no promises beyond 1 week." She swallowed. 1 week is work. He took her carpet bag before she could protest and set it in the back of the wagon. When Nell climbed up, the little boy shifted away from her, still silent, still clutching the wooden horse. Thomas gathered the reins and looked straight ahead. "I need a cook, Miss Harper, not a wife, not a nursemaid, and not a woman looking for pity." Nell folded her hands in her lap so he would not see them tremble. "That is fine, Mr. Alder. I have never known what to do with pity." The buckboard rolled out of Sweetwater, past the church steeple, past the mercantile windows where faces turned to watch, and into 12 miles of open country where the wind moved through the grass like a warning. Nell did not yet know that the boy beside her had not spoken a full sentence in months, or that the man holding the reins had forbidden every room in his house from remembering warmth. She only knew the sun was dropping, the child was hungry whether he admitted it or not, and somewhere ahead there was a kitchen waiting to be brought back from the dead. By the time Alder Creek Ranch rose out of the evening grass, Nell understood why Thomas Alder had spoken so little on the road. The place did not welcome sound. The main house sat low against the Wyoming sky, its porch gray with weather, its windows dark except for one thin stripe of stove light leaking through the kitchen glass. A windmill turned slowly near the barn with a tired metal groan, and beyond it the corral stood empty in the purple dusk. It was not a poor ranch. Nell could see that in the straight fence lines, the repaired gate, the good stock horse tied beneath the lean-to. It was something sadder than poor. It was a place kept standing by duty after Joy had moved out. Thomas stopped the buckboard beside the porch and stepped down. The little boy waited until his father reached for him, then climbed into Thomas's arms without a word, still holding the wooden horse against his chest. Nell climbed down by herself and lifted her torn carpet bag before Thomas could take it again. He noticed. She noticed him noticing. Neither of them spoke. Inside, the house smelled of cold ashes, old coffee, and rooms shut too long. The front room held a stone fireplace swept clean but unlit. A woman's shawl hung on a peg near the door, pale blue and untouched by dust, as if someone had placed it there yesterday and expected to come back for it. Nell looked away before Thomas saw her looking. Luke slipped from his father's arms and disappeared halfway up the stairs, where he sat on the 4th step and watched through the railing. Thomas set his hat on the table. "Kitchen is this way." Nell followed him through a narrow doorway and stopped. The kitchen was large enough to feed a dozen men, but it had the stillness of a church after a funeral. Flour had hardened inside a cracked crock. A kettle sat empty on the stove. A child's chair stood pushed against the far wall, one leg shorter than the others. On a hook beside the pantry hung a faded yellow apron with careful stitching across the pocket. Sarah Alder. Nell read the name before she could stop herself. Thomas's voice came from behind her, flat and sharp. Do not wear that. Nell turned. I was not going to. Do not move it either. No, sir. He pointed toward the stove. Wood is in the box. Water pump is behind the house. Pantry is thin until I ride to town again. You cook breakfast and supper. Noon meal is bread, cold meat if there is any, beans if there is not. Nell nodded, setting her carpetbag near the back door. And Luke? Thomas glanced toward the stairway, where the boy's eyes vanished between two rails. You do not touch my boy unless he asks. Nell kept her hands folded. I understand. You do not ask him questions. You do not chase him with a spoon. You do not tell him he has to be brave. People have told him enough foolish things. There was pain under that last sentence, but Thomas covered it quickly. You do your work. You take meals in the kitchen. You do not sit in my wife's chair in the front room. You do not speak of her unless I speak first. Nell looked at the apron again, then back at him. I understand that too. He stepped closer, not unkindly, but with the guarded stiffness of a man setting fence posts around the last piece of land he still knew how to protect. Miss Harper, I am not hiring comfort. I am not hiring company. I am hiring supper. Nell felt the old familiar heat rise in her face, the same heat from the station platform, from boarding houses, from church ladies who smiled with their teeth and measured her worth by how much space she took in a room. But she had crossed 12 miles of dust for work, and pride did not make stew. She lifted her chin. Then supper is what you will have. Thomas held her gaze for a breath longer, as if searching for complaint and finding none. There are potatoes in the bin. Any onions? 2. Milk. Sour by morning. Eggs. If the hens were kinder than yesterday. For the first time, something almost moved at the corner of his mouth, but it was gone before it became anything human. He turned to leave. Halfway through the doorway he stopped. The boy eats at 6. Or he sits at the table at 6. Those are not the same thing anymore. Then he went outside, and the kitchen grew quiet again. Nell stood alone beside the cold iron stove, listening to Thomas's boots cross the porch and Luke's small breath somewhere on the stairs. She untied her recipe book, rolled up her sleeves and reached for the wood box. She would not touch the yellow apron. She would not sit in the dead woman's chair. She would not ask the child to trust her before she had earned it. But before dark, by God's mercy and her own 2 hands, this house was going to smell like bread. Nell did not begin by calling the kitchen hers. She began by asking permission of every silent thing inside it. She moved the cracked flour crock to the work table, cleaned the hardened rim with warm water, and saved what little flour had not gone stale. She scrubbed the iron stove until old grease lifted from the seams. She pumped 2 buckets of water from behind the house, carrying them slow and steady so her breath would not turn ragged before anyone could see. By the time the last rim of daylight slipped behind the barn, the kitchen had changed its mind about being dead. A fire glowed inside the stove. Potato skins curled on the counter. The 2 onions Thomas had mentioned softened in a pan with a little salt, and the smell reached into the hallway like a hand held out without asking to be taken. Luke stayed on the stairs. Nell knew he was there because the 4th step creaked whenever he shifted his weight. She never turned too quickly. She never said his name unless Thomas said it first. She only set 3 places at the table, then hesitated and added 1 small blue bowl near the corner seat where a child could reach it without feeling trapped. Thomas came in at 6 with wind in his coat and hay dust on his cuffs. He stopped in the doorway. Nell saw his eyes move over the clean counter, the mended fire, the biscuits cooling beneath a towel. He did not praise her. Men like Thomas Alder looked at goodness as if it might charge interest later. Supper is ready, she said. Luke slipped into the room and climbed onto his chair after Thomas pulled it out. Nell served Thomas first because this was his house. Then she placed a modest spoonful of potato stew in Luke's blue bowl and set half a biscuit beside it, split open with butter tucked into the middle. The boy stared at the food as if it had insulted him. Thomas watched too closely. Nell saw Luke's hand tighten around the wooden horse in his lap, so she made herself busy at the stove. She turned her back, lifted the kettle, wiped a clean place that was already clean, and hummed so softly it hardly counted as sound. No one spoke for a long time. Then came the smallest scrape of a spoon against a bowl. Thomas went still. Nell did not turn. The scrape came again. Then again. A chair leg shifted. A biscuit broke. Nell kept her face toward the stove, but her throat tightened so suddenly she had to swallow twice. When she finally carried coffee to the table, Luke's bowl was not empty, but it was no longer full, for bites had gone missing. Thomas looked at those. For missing bites as if they were tracks in fresh snow leading out of a place he had been lost in for years. "Enough," Luke whispered, the first word Nell had heard him speak. His voice was small and rusty. Thomas lowered his head, pretending to study his plate. Nell took the bowl without smiling too much. "That is all right," she said. "A body knows when it has had enough." The next morning she tried again. She made oatmeal with brown sugar shaved thin as sand, not stirred in, only sprinkled on one side so Luke could decide whether sweetness touched his spoon. He refused it while Thomas sat there. Nell carried the bowl to the far end of the work table and left it beside the carved wooden horse after Luke wandered away. An hour later, when she returned from feeding scraps to the hens, the bowl was scraped clean. She did not mention it. At noon she made bread and cut one slice into 4 small squares. By sundown only 1 square remained. On the third evening, Luke entered the kitchen before his father and climbed into the same corner chair without being asked. Thomas came in behind him and stopped so abruptly the door nearly swung shut against his shoulder. Nell placed the blue bowl down, spoon turned toward Luke's right hand. The boy looked at her, then at the bowl, then at the chair by the cold front room fireplace where his mother's memory still sat like a folded shawl. "You did not move her apron," he said. Nell's hand stilled over the breadboard. Thomas drew in a breath. Nell answered gently, "No, sweetheart. Some things ought to wait until the people who love them are ready." Luke looked down, picked up his spoon and took a bite while everyone could see. On the 4th morning, rain came soft over Alder Creek Ranch, not hard enough to flood the yard, only steady enough to silver the fence rails and turn the barn roof dark. Nell liked rain better than wind. Wind shoved at a body. Rain only asked to be heard. She had biscuits in the oven, coffee warming on the back of the stove, and Luke sitting at the far end of the kitchen table with a pencil in his fist and a sheet of brown wrapping paper in front of him. He was not writing much. Mostly he drew the same crooked horse over and over, each one a little larger than the last. Thomas had gone to check the east pasture before breakfast, but Nell could feel him in the house even when he was outside, the way a person feels the weight of a closed door. She reached for the flour sack on the pantry shelf, and the blue ribbon around her recipe book snagged on a nail. The book slipped from the stack, struck the floor, and opened with a tired flutter. A folded paper slid out across the clean boards. Nell moved quickly but not quickly enough. Thomas had come in through the back door with rain on his hat and saw it before she reached it. He bent, picked it up and held it toward her without meaning to read. But the paper had already opened in his hand. Nell saw the moment the words found his eyes. No man wants a woman who takes up that much room. The kitchen seemed to lose its warmth all at once. Luke stopped drawing. The pencil rested in his small hand, forgotten. Nell took the paper from Thomas carefully, as if it were something hot from the stove. "That is old," she said. Thomas did not answer. His face had gone still in that dangerous quiet way of men who did not know what to do with hurt unless it belonged to a fence, a horse or a bill that needed paying. Nell folded the paper once, then twice. It should not have fallen out. "Who wrote it?" His voice was low. "Someone who was glad to be done with me." "That is not an answer." "It is the kindest one I have." Thomas looked from the folded paper to her face, then to the recipe book on the floor. Its pages were stained with molasses, thumbed soft at the corners, crowded with careful handwriting and little notes beside each dish. "Add cinnamon if the child wakes sad. Use less salt when grief has ruined the appetite. Cut bread small for little hands." Nell crouched to gather it, her skirt pulling tight at her knees, her cheeks hot with the old shame of being seen too clearly. Thomas reached down at the same time, and their hands nearly touched over the book. Nell pulled hers back first. "Mr. Alder," she said, keeping her voice even, "supper burns if we stare at sorrow too long. I did not hire you to hide sorrow in my kitchen. No. You hired me to make breakfast. Miss Harper." She pressed the folded paper into the pocket of her apron. His name was Warren Bell. He was a clerk in Council Bluffs. He asked me to marry him in January and changed his mind in March after his sisters said I would shame him standing beside him at church. He left that note with my returned gloves. The biscuits inside the oven gave off a warm golden smell, gentle and ordinary, almost cruel in its timing. Luke slid down from his chair, walked to Nell, and placed his crooked horse drawing on the edge of the work table. He did not hug her. He did not call her anything. He only pushed the picture toward her with one finger and whispered, "This one is big." Nell looked at the horse, larger than the others, taking up nearly the whole page. "Yes," she said, and her smile trembled but did not break. "It surely is." Luke looked at Thomas, then back at Nell. "Big is not bad." Thomas turned toward the window, jaw tight, rainwater dripping from the brim of his hat onto the floor. When he faced her again, the coldness in him had shifted into something heavier. "No," he said. "It is not." Nell opened the oven and took out the biscuits before they browned too much. Her hands were steady. She had learned to keep working through humiliation, through hunger, through rooms that made her feel too large to be loved and too useful to be dismissed. But that morning, when Thomas quietly repaired the loose pantry nail without being asked, and Luke left the biggest horse drawing beside her recipe book, the kitchen held a different kind of silence. Not empty. Listening. By late afternoon the rain had settled into the bones of the house, tapping at the windows, whispering along the porch roof, darkening the yard until the barn looked farther away than it truly was. Nell kept the kitchen warm because warmth was a language she trusted. She set beans to simmer, folded clean towels near the stove, and helped Luke sound out the word horse from an old primer Thomas found in a drawer. Luke did not like reading aloud, but he liked sitting near the breadboard while Nell worked. He liked the way she waited. He liked that she never reached for his paper unless he pushed it toward her first. Thomas watched from the doorway more than once, saying nothing, his shoulder against the frame, his hat in his hand. The ranch had begun to make small noises again, ordinary noises, almost forgotten ones. A spoon in a cup. A chair pulled closer to the stove. A child asking for one more slice of bread without fear that the asking would cost him something. Then just after supper Luke shivered. It was small at first. A tremble through his narrow shoulders as he sat with both hands around his cup. Thomas noticed before Nell did. He crossed the room in 3 strides and touched the back of his hand to the boy's forehead. All the color left his face. "He is warm." Nell came around the table, careful not to crowd. Luke blinked up at them, eyes too bright. "I am not cold," he whispered, though his teeth worried at the edge of the words. Thomas lifted him from the chair, and the wooden horse tumbled to the floor. The sound made Thomas flinch as if memory itself had dropped between them. "I will ride for the doctor." "Not in this rain," Nell said. He turned on her, not angry, only afraid in a way that had lost its manners. "My wife had a fever." The words came raw and plain, and the room went still around them. Nell did not soften her face with pity. She took a folded towel from the stove rail and laid it over her arm. "Then we will not waste time frightening the child." Thomas stared at her. Luke's cheek rested against his father's shoulder, his eyes closing and opening in heavy little blinks. Nell's voice stayed calm. "Put him in his bed. I need cool water, clean cloths, and the broth from the back of the stove. Not hot. Warm. Bring the lamp closer, but not too close." Thomas obeyed because she gave him work, and work was the only bridge he knew across terror. Upstairs, Luke's room smelled of cedar, rain, and little boy sleep. A quilt with blue squares lay folded at the foot of the bed. Nell turned it back, saw the careful stitches, and knew without asking whose hands had made it. Thomas laid Luke down as gently as if the child were made of candle flame. Nell dipped a cloth in cool water, wrung it out, and placed it across Luke's forehead. "Sweetheart," she murmured, "you do not have to be brave. You only have to rest." Thomas stood at the foot of the bed, both hands gripping the rail. Sarah said that once. Nell kept her eyes on Luke. Then she said a true thing. The hours moved slowly. Rain thickened against the roof. The lamp burned low. Thomas carried water. Nell changed cloths, spooned broth between Luke's lips when he woke enough to swallow, and hummed the same tune she used when waiting for bread to rise. Near midnight, Luke stirred, turned his face toward her hand, and whispered through the fever, "Mama." Thomas went rigid. Nell's own breath caught, but she did not let the word become something greedy in the room. She brushed Luke's damp hair from his forehead with the lightest touch. "No, sweetheart," she whispered. "Just Nell." Luke's fingers curled around hers. "Stay. I am here." Thomas looked away toward the dark window, and for a moment Nell saw the man beneath the rancher. Not cold, not hard, only a father who had already lost too much and feared God might be counting again. Before dawn, Luke's fever eased. His breathing settled. Thomas sank into the chair beside the bed, one hand over his eyes. Nell sat on the floor with her back against the wall, too tired to move, her apron creased, her hair loosened from its pins. The house was quiet, but this time the quiet did not feel empty. It felt like something had survived the night. By the time Sunday came, Luke was well enough to sit upright at the kitchen table with toast in one hand and his wooden horse in the other, but Thomas still watched him as if the fever might return through any crack left unguarded. Nell kept breakfast simple that morning: soft eggs, warm bread, apple butter thinly spread, and coffee strong enough to wake the ranch hands before chapel. She had slept little since the fever night, yet there was a quiet steadiness in her now that even Thomas seemed careful around. He no longer stopped at the kitchen door like a stranger. He stepped inside. To fill the wood box. He mended the loose latch on the pantry. He set a sack of fresh flour beside the work table without announcing it, as if kindness might slip past them easier if it wore the clothes of chores. Luke noticed everything. Children always did. After breakfast, Thomas unfolded a cream-colored envelope that had been waiting on the mantel since Saturday. Nell had seen the handwriting already, tall and elegant, the kind that made even ink look proud. "Mrs. Vale is hosting the church supper tonight," Thomas said. "Pastor Reeves says the whole town is expected." Nell kept wiping the same clean plate. "Then you and Luke should go. She asked that I bring my household." The word landed strangely. Household. Not cook. Not hired help. Not exactly family either. Nell placed the plate on the shelf. "I can stay here and have supper ready when you return." Luke set his toast down. "Nell goes." Thomas looked at his son, surprised by the certainty in that small voice. Nell smiled gently. "Church suppers are for church folks, sweetheart. You feed church folks too." There was no answer to that simple truth. Thomas's mouth tightened, but not in displeasure. "Pack 2 pies if you have the makings," he said at last. "We will not go empty-handed." The church hall in Sweetwater glowed with lamps by 6 o'clock, all golden windows and polished manners, with wagons lined along the road and horses tied near the hitching rail. Nell carried 1 apple pie and 1 buttermilk pie through the side door because Mrs. Vale's hired girl had pointed her toward the kitchen without asking Thomas. "Food goes back there," the girl said, eyes sliding over Nell's dress, her apron, her plain gloves. Thomas heard it. Nell knew he heard it because his hand paused on Luke's shoulder, but the pastor came forward at that same moment, smiling too broadly, and swept him into talk of land, weather, and the banknote coming due. Beatrice Vale crossed the room like she owned every board beneath her shoes. She wore dark green silk, pearl buttons, and a widow's smile polished bright enough to cut. "Mr. Alder," she said, touching Luke's cheek with 2 gloved fingers before the boy could move away. "How relieved we all are to see your son restored." Luke stepped behind Thomas. Beatrice's eyes shifted to Nell near the kitchen door. "And your cook has certainly made herself useful." "Miss Harper," Thomas said. Beatrice smiled wider. "Of course. Miss Harper." In the kitchen, Nell was given a stack of plates and told where to stand. No one asked whether she wished to sit. No one said she had earned a place at the table after bringing food that half the room praised without knowing whose hands had made it. She served beans, ham, biscuits, and slices of her own pie while women whispered behind folded napkins. Then Amos Pike, the banker, arrived with his silver watch chain and his soft voice, and the air changed. He stood with Beatrice beside Thomas near the front of the hall, speaking quietly enough to seem polite and loudly enough for people to hear. "The note on Alder Creek could be extended," he said, "under the right domestic arrangement. Stability mattered. Appearances mattered. A motherless child needed a suitable woman in the house." Beatrice lowered her eyes like a practiced saint. No one wants to see that dear boy confused, she said. A lonely child will cling to any warm hand, Thomas, but a rancher must know the difference between comfort and respectability. Nell stood with a serving spoon in her hand while the words found her from across the room. Luke heard them too. His small face went pale, and Thomas turned very slowly, as if every lamp in the hall had gone cold at once. For one long breath, no one in the church hall moved. Beatrice Vale still wore her careful smile, but the corners had begun to strain. Amos Pike slipped his watch back into his vest as if time itself had become uncomfortable. Nell stood beside the serving table with a spoon in her hand, her apron dusted with flour, her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her wrists. She had heard words like Beatrice's all her life, polished or plain, whispered behind fans or spoken across counters. Too large, too plain, too useful to honor, too easy to dismiss. She knew how to survive them. She lowered her eyes, set the spoon down, and reached for another plate because work was the only shield she had ever been allowed to carry. Then Luke moved. He slipped out from behind his father and walked into the open space between the tables. Thomas reached for him, but Luke shook his head once, small and steady. The room watched the boy cross the floor, past Mrs. Ellis with her lace collar, past Pastor Reeves with his hand frozen around a coffee cup, past Amos Pike in his quiet calculations. Luke stopped in front of Nell and looked up at her as if the whole crowded hall had disappeared. She did not bend to him. She did not touch him first. Thomas had given her that rule, and even now, with the room pressing judgment into her back, she would not take what had not been freely offered. Luke lifted his hand and placed it in hers. His fingers were warm, smaller than the biscuit he had carried from the supper table, but his grip held like a promise. Beatrice gave a light laugh that landed wrong. There now, Luke. Sweet boy, you are only confused. Luke turned, still holding Nell's hand. I am not confused. His voice was not loud, but it carried because the hall had gone so still. She did not ask me to call her anything. A woman near the window drew in a soft breath. Thomas stood by the front table, his face unreadable, but his eyes never left his son. Luke swallowed, then spoke again. She did not sit in Mama's chair. She did not wear Mama's apron. She did not make me eat when I could not. She cut my bread small and turned around so I did not have to be watched. Nell's vision blurred, but she kept her chin lifted. Luke leaned against her skirt, not hiding this time, choosing. She stayed when I was sick, he said. She stayed when Pa was scared. Thomas closed his eyes. The truth of that sentence crossed the room more powerfully than any sermon Pastor Reeves had ever preached. Beatrice's face flushed. Thomas, surely you will not allow a child to decide the future of your ranch. Thomas opened his eyes and stepped forward. His boots sounded against the floorboards, slow, certain, without anger and without apology. He stopped beside Nell and Luke, not in front of them, not blocking them from view, but standing with them where everyone could see. No, he said. My son is not deciding my ranch. Amos Pike cleared his throat. Then perhaps we can return to practical matters. Thomas looked at him. We are on practical matters. His voice had the calm weight of a gate closing. A house is not saved by money alone. A child is not raised by appearances. And a woman is not made respectable by silk gloves, nor made unworthy by an apron. No one spoke. Thomas turned toward Beatrice. You spoke of warm hands as if warmth were a weakness. It is not. It is what kept my boy at the table. It is what kept my house from becoming nothing but walls. Beatrice's smile was gone now. And what is she to you, Thomas? Nell's hand tightened around Luke's before she could stop it. Thomas looked at her then, truly looked, past the apron, past the flour, past every cruel measurement the world had placed upon her. Her name is Nell Harper, he said. She came to Alder Creek as a cook. His voice softened, but it did not lose strength. But she is leaving this hall as family. Luke looked up at Nell, his gray eyes bright with the courage it had cost him. Mama, he whispered, then louder for the whole town to hear. Can we go home now? The church hall held its breath. Nell knelt slowly, careful of her dress, careful of her own breaking heart, and cupped his hand between both of hers. Yes, sweetheart, she said. We can go home. Thomas reached for her carpetbag near the kitchen door before she could carry it herself. though there was nothing in it but a folded shawl and a recipe book. Then he opened the hall door. Cold night air swept in, clean and honest. Behind them no one laughed. No one whispered. Not one soul dared call her only a cook again. The ride back to Alder Creek Ranch was quiet, but it was not the old quiet. The old quiet had sat between Thomas and Luke like a locked door, heavy with things neither of them knew how to say. This quiet rode beside them under the stars, soft and breathing, with Luke asleep between his father and Nell, his small hand still tangled in the edge of her shawl. Thomas drove the buckboard with one hand on the reins and the other resting near his son, not holding him too tight, only near enough for the boy to know he could. Nell watched the dark prairie roll past, silvered by moonlight, and tried to understand how a woman could leave for a church supper as hired help and come home with the word family following her through the cold night air. When the ranch lights came into view, Luke stirred. "Are we home?" he whispered. Thomas looked at the house, at the kitchen window glowing where he had left the lamp burning, at the porch where grief had once seemed nailed into every board. "Yes, son," he said. "We are home." Nell helped Luke down before Thomas could stop her, and this time Thomas did not remind her of any rule. The three of them entered through the kitchen because that was the warmest door, and the room received them with banked coals, the smell of pie crust, and the faint dusting of flour Nell had missed on the table. Luke went straight to the yellow apron on the hook, Sarah Alder's apron, and stood before it for a long moment. Nell held her breath. Thomas set his hat down slowly. Luke touched the hem with 2 fingers, then looked back at Nell. "She can stay there," he said. "And you can stay too." Thomas turned away, but not before Nell saw his eyes shine in the lamplight. No one moved the apron that night. No one had to. Some love did not leave when new love entered. Some rooms were large enough to hold both memory and mourning. In the weeks that followed, Sweetwater changed its tongue. Mrs. Vale stopped calling at the ranch. Amos Pike discovered that Thomas Alder had more friends than he thought, because 3 ranchers, a blacksmith, and Pastor Reeves himself came forward to witness that Alder Creek was worth more standing free than being squeezed into another man's ledger. Thomas paid what he could, worked off what he could not, and never again let the banker speak to Nell as if she were furniture in another man's house. The ranch hands began washing up before supper without being told. Luke began leaving his drawings beside Nell's recipe book, each horse bigger than the last, until one day he drew 3 figures beside the barn. A tall man, a round woman in an apron, and a little boy between them. Beneath it, in crooked letters, he wrote home. Nell kept the drawing in the front of her book where the cruel note had once been. She did not burn the old note. She folded it smaller and smaller until it no longer seemed powerful enough to hurt her. Spring came green across the Wyoming grass. Bread rose higher in the warm kitchen. The blue bowl stayed at Luke's place, though he no longer needed coaxing to eat. Thomas began sitting at the table after supper instead of carrying his coffee outside alone. Sometimes he spoke of Sarah, not often but gently, as if remembering her no longer meant losing her again. Nell listened without reaching for what was not hers, and because she did not reach, Thomas slowly offered. One evening, nearly a year after the rail station where she had been left with $3 and a torn carpet bag, Nell came in from the garden to find Luke covered in flour and Thomas standing by the stove with an apron folded over his arm. It was new cream-colored strong cotton, stitched carefully in blue thread. Nell saw the name before he said a word. Nell Alder. Her hand rose to her mouth. Thomas looked less steady than he did facing storms, bankers, or a room full of judgment. "I know you came here for work," he said. "I know I gave you rules when I should have given you thanks. I cannot promise an easy life. This ranch will ask hard things. I will make mistakes. So will the boy." Luke frowned. "Not many." Nell laughed then, and the sound filled the kitchen like a window opening. Thomas stepped closer. "But I can promise you this. You were never too much for this house. We were too empty before you came." Nell touched the stitched name with trembling fingers. "Thomas." "Stay," he said, the same word Luke had whispered through fever, only now it was a man's whole heart laid bare in one plain syllable. Nell looked at Luke, who was holding up a lopsided biscuit as if it were a wedding ring, then back at the stove, the table, the apron of the woman who had been loved before her, and the new apron waiting in Thomas's hands. "Yes," she said. "I will stay." Months later, when the first snow returned to Alder Creek, The kitchen burned bright against the dark. Luke laughed with flour on his nose. Thomas carried in firewood and paused in the doorway just to watch his wife shape dough beneath the lamplight. The house that had once swallowed